Hi guys, and welcome back to this week's episode of Let's Chat Ethics. I'm your co-host Ariana.
And I'm your other co-host Amanda.
And today we have another really incredible guest joining us. And it's been a really amazing few weeks for Amanda and I on the podcast, as we've had two really fantastic guests join us. And we've been lucky enough to hear them both share their expert opinions and insights into the sector. So today we have Mark Durkee joining us from the Centre for Data Ethics and Innovation. And Mark and his team recently published a report called Review into Bias in Algorithmic Decision-Making. And on today's podcast, we're going to be getting kind of the overall findings of the report, the overall conclusions, and Mark will be answering a few further questions. So we're really excited for you to hear today's episode, and we hope you enjoy. Hi, Mark. So thank you so much for joining us today. And if you could just introduce yourself for our audience and what you do and what your kind of role involves and what the Centre for Data Ethics and Innovation actually does, that would be amazing.
Hi, Anna. Thanks for having me on the podcast. Really great to talk about this. So I'm Mark Durkee. I work for an organisation called the Centre for Data Ethics and Innovation, which is an independent advisory body to the UK government looking at a whole wide range of issues around data ethics. And I suppose our remit's a fairly cross-cutting one. So we aren't really a deeply technical body, although we do have some very technical people in the organisation. We aren't a regulator. We also aren't government. Our role is to really cross the boundaries between all of those things and think through how should government respond to some of the challenges with data ethics and data governance. What are the ways in which government policy on some of these issues can be taken forwards and made practical? How can we think not only about what a policy should be around what data ethics is, but what are the practical things that regulators, organisations, public sector organisations and private sector ones ought to be doing to actually make sure the way in which they're using data, the way in which they're using algorithms is not only effective and innovative, but also ethical. And we have an independent board with 12 kind of fairly well-known experts. So I'm going to cut it across sort of data policy type areas, some very technically capable people, and also some people with a really good understanding of public trust and some of the concerns of the wider public around these issues. And when we were set up a couple of years ago, government asked us to carry out two major reviews into some big topics in data ethics. And one was on online targeting, which we published earlier this year, looking at some of the challenges that come from the way in which platforms target content at people online. And found some quite interesting things in that. I mean, partly around the challenges, but also around the fact that a lot of people do find this quite valuable. They like the fact that they get adverts that are relevant to them. They like the fact that Spotify can target useful music at them. But also there are clearly some risks and some possible harms and some things that government should be doing about that. And then more recently, on the topic of this podcast, we published Secular's Reviews, which is a review into bias in algorithmic decision-making, which was looking at some, what I think are now fairly widespread concerns around the possible harm that bias in algorithms could cause. And obviously some of the events of the summer have brought this to kind of wider public attention than maybe it ever had been before. So it's been an interesting time for us to publish the review.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you for giving us the overview there. I think for our audience, it would be great if you could maybe give a general overview of the report and maybe some of the overall conclusions and findings that were maybe important to you and important to the organisation as a whole.
Yeah, really happy to do that. So the report, by the way, is on CDEI's website, which sits as part of Gov.uk. I think probably if you Google for Gov.uk and CDEI bias, you can quite easily find it.
Yeah, we can link to it in the podcast description as well.
Perfect. So we looked at four sectors originally in this review. So we were interested in looking at some sectors which involve some really significant decisions about individuals. So our algorithms are involved in lots of types of decisions. Some of them are individually quite minor, the sorts of decisions about which advert Amanda gets when she visits a website. That is a decision about you based on your personal information. Often, at the level of individual decision, at least, it's not that significant. It's not that life affecting. There are some interesting bias issues around those. We focused in this review mainly at the really big decisions. So we looked at policing, where there is the start of the use of algorithms to make decisions about who is risky, who is not risky, both from the point of view of causing harm to others. who should we keep in custody, who should we let go, what's the right risk assessment to make, but also who is at risk of being a victim. So there's one police force in the UK which has started in a very tentative way to try to do some risk assessment of people at risk of domestic violence. So how do you work out who are the people that you should be targeting interventions at to support them because they're likely to need support? And I think it's fair to say in policing there's not a huge amount of kind of real live systems going on in the UK. There's a lot of police forces starting to play with what the possibilities are and starting to understand where there could be benefit. It's not that widespread yet, although it clearly could grow. So we looked at policing, we looked at financial services, which is interesting in a different way. And it's a much more mature sector for use of this type of technology. For decades, insurance companies, banks have been using algorithms and models and statistics of various kind to assess how much should you pay for your insurance, how risky are you, what's the chance you might or might not pay back this loan. That, I think, is quite an interesting comparison point for lots of the other sectors you might look at. There is much more maturity in how that's governed, so there are rules about what information is and isn't okay to use in making an insurance decision. I think probably the most well-known thing is looking at male and female pricing of car insurance. It was quite a well-known case, probably 5 years ago now, saying that actually you shouldn't be using sex as a explicit determiner of price. And then we also looked at recruitment. So there's, I think, increasingly widespread use of various algorithmic tools in recruitment, and both to sift CVs. You get a large number of CVs in. How do you pick the 10 that you want to interview? Various companies offering tools that do that in a fairly automated way, as well as lots of kind of interesting, although I mean possibly slightly debatably useful tools, things like video interviewing and assessing quality of people in automated video interviews. And then finally we looked at local government, and we particularly looked at areas around children's social care and some of the kind of risk assessment type procedures that all local authorities have to use when working out who are children at risk, how much at risk are they, what interventions are appropriate. And that, I think it's fair to say, we discovered when we looked at it that no one has got very far with the use of algorithms in that space. There's a few local authorities that are starting to investigate, what value can it add to do some more statistical assessment of where risk is, following on from some fairly awful cases we've had over the last few years of people being missed and risk assessments just being got wrong on missing key bits. But it is, no one has got very far yet, as far as we can tell, with actually deploying those things into operational use. Now, there are some interesting discussions around it.
Okay, that's great. Thank you for the summary. So I actually wanted to ask you more about the first point of policing, and I was wondering if you could maybe discuss more your findings in terms of that. I think it's very topical for 2020, where there was a lot of I guess in the US mainly demonstrations about the policing and the use of I guess facial recognition. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about your findings in that.
Yeah, policing is an interesting area, and definitely one that 2020 has brought into sharp focus for all of it. I suppose there's three groups of algorithms that are kind of interesting in policing and law enforcement at the moment. There's facial recognition, which you mentioned, which actually isn't as new in law enforcement as is sometimes perceived. There have been facial recognition things of various sorts going on for decades in this sort of space. What I suppose is new is the ability to match faces on live video. So to start, potentially using it for picking up people from live CCTV screens, and some of the kind of surveillance type impacts of that I think are genuinely new and worthy of discussion. And actually CDEI published a separate snapshot paper, as we called it, on facial recognition a few months back, where we looked at some of this in quite a lot of detail. There is data analytics, which is mostly what we focus on here, which is using kind of algorithmic tools and statistical models to assess risk. There has been a lot of coverage of some of this in the US, as you mentioned. So an algorithm called Compass, which is a proprietary algorithm used by lots of different local policing bodies in the US, with some fairly debatable statistics underneath, kind of lots and lots of different bits of input data. A fairly unclear process, or this initially unclear process about how it did or didn't use that data to make decisions. And there are a lot of really quite, from a academic point of view, really quite interesting debate around was it fair or was it not fair. I think one of the things it brings out is that fairness is definitely not a universal concept. So there are some sort of statistical notions of fairness and bias where it looked horrendously unfair. Actually, there are some other ways of looking at it where people say, well, actually, maybe it wasn't so unfair after all. And I think that is perhaps a lesson to learn from that, aside from generally thinking about whether this use is appropriate, is you do need to be really explicit about what you're trying to achieve on fairness. It's far too simplistic to say, is it biased or is it not biased, or is it fair or is it not fair? Actually, you need to say, does fair mean, outcomes are proportionately the same across different groups by ethnicity or by sex or by some other characteristic? Or do you mean that outcomes should be the same across those groups for two people with an equal number of past convictions or an equal income or some other factor that may be more directly relevant? And that's not something you can answer in generality. I don't think there's any kind of answer that CDEI or anybody else can give which says in general for algorithms fair or unbiased means this. You've got to think about it in the context of how that decision is used. And in the UK, there are some kind of interesting early steps going on some of this stuff. I think we are a long way behind, if that's the right term, the US in this space. And it's certainly not the case that UK police forces are kind of widely using loads of algorithms all over the place. So I think Durham have experimented a little bit with an algorithm called HEART, which is looking at risk assessment for custody decisions. Do you keep somebody in custody? Do you let them go? How do you consistently make those decisions in a reliable way? Hampshire, I think it is, although I could have misremembered the force. I think I've been doing some stuff looking at domestic violence and how do you assess the risk that somebody might be a victim of domestic violence and make sure that you're providing the support you need for that. And again, I think it's very much at an experimental stage. It's not something which the police are using routinely. And the underlying concern of lots of it is the way in which the data comes into this. So obviously there is history in the UK and the US of bias in policing. There are some clear historical patterns where different groups probably do get arrested at different rates for similar crimes. I think there's also some evidence of convictions at different rates. The way in which modern machine learning algorithms start to draw inferences and start to make predictions is usually based on historical data. So there's a fairly clear theoretical risk that if you take all data about arrests of people in the past and you then use that to say, these are the people who are going to commit crimes in the future, so I'll assess the risk of someone committing a crime based on that data, that you are not necessarily assessing risk of crime, but you may well be assessing records of historical policing of crime, and at least to an extent. And that potentially reinforces itself as well. So if you're then making decisions about, for example, where you're policing in the future, it may not even be at an individual level who you are arresting or who you are targeting. It may be what streets you're walking down, what areas do you think are at risk of crime. And there's of course a risk that self-reinforces. You use an algorithm to target where your resources are going, you find more crime in those areas, and hence the next round of data into the algorithm reinforces the issue. Fair to say that in this review we haven't found any actual evidence of this happening in the UK at the moment. I think it's very much in the theoretical risk space, but it is a risk that we do all need to be aware of. I think police forces increasingly are thinking this through as they're doing this. Where we think there is a bit more need for some clarity, and this is a bit of a kind of structural point really, is that policing is very complicated in the UK, and for various quite good historical reasons. We have a lot of police forces. We don't have a big national police force like they do in France, for example. We have a collection of local forces that all have quite substantial autonomy for how they do things. And I think many of those forces do feel a little bit uncertain in this space. They're experimenting with some new and novel things to try to police better and to try to police more fairly. They do feel they could use some better national coordination and national guidance about what is and isn't appropriate. And I know that various national policing bodies, the Home Office, who are the government department responsible for this, National Police Chiefs Council and others are thinking about who is best placed to provide that guidance and provide a bit more national coordination. And I suppose the third area, which I didn't mention, so long answer, is there's also a lot of interest in digital forensics and what is an appropriate amount of data for a police officer to gather from somebody's mobile phone when they're investigating a crime, and indeed what of that should be released, for example, to the defence in a prosecution. And that's been an area of huge controversy. We haven't looked at that in this review, but I think that is another area where there's lots of fascinating data ethics issues to think about.
Yeah, that's a very interesting area. I know that's something that the US government, I think, were trying to sue Apple over, trying to get contents of a phone. So that's definitely one that's definitely been highlighted in the media. So in AI ethics, I know, and in the AI community, people are speaking a lot about like fairness and transparency and explainability. So could you discuss the need for the UK government to consider frameworks for ethical AI in relation to fairness, transparency and explainability?
Yeah, so I think probably frameworks is a wrong place to focus right now in the conversation. So there are plenty of frameworks out there. There are lots of frameworks for doing AI ethically, and the UK government has at least one, probably several ethical AI frameworks, and has for a number of years. So there's the data ethics framework, which was published probably 3 or 4 years ago and was refreshed fairly recently, which is a good kind of structured way of thinking about lots of these issues. There's some very detailed guidance that the government published with the Alan Turing Institute a year or two ago. It's about 100 pages plus of guidance about how to think these things through systematically. Lots of detailed thinking in there. I think where it's more interesting to think right now on how to move this forward is around getting the incentives right for organisations in the public and the private sector. And there's a few incentives that possibly are a little bit perverse at the moment. So if you think about, if you imagine you're a team working in a public sector project trying to deliver an algorithmic solution, you probably want to talk about it publicly. Let's assume good intentions on the part of a team, and a desire to talk openly with the public about what they're doing, why they're doing it, and to try to get some good feedback about is it working well, is it working fairly. Now, it's quite likely if you do that the reaction from the public is not going to be great. There have been lots of cases of there's an algorithm, mutant algorithm, won't it be bad? And I think for a senior decision maker in the public sector or even a minister, it's probably quite brave to say let's have an open conversation about this. And with other bits of tech, we got there a few years ago. I think we have the emergence of the government digital service and kind of digital and agile ways of working. It has really taken hold in the UK public sector. We are much more open about how we're building technology, lots more use of open standards, open source, open conversations about what's being built. I think for algorithms, it still feels a bit scary. And we do see a need for the government to be really bullish, actually, and say, no, actually, we are going to be open about all algorithms as we're building them. And partly that's intended to kind of allow oversight of what government is doing. Partly it's intended just to actually make it easy for teams to do the engagement they need to do. If everyone's open about it all the time, then suddenly it's not that interesting when a department or another public body is starting to talk about building an algorithm. And that sort of openness, I think, opens up the ability to have the right conversations about what's fair, what's not fair, what are the things that should be thought about, who could be impacted by this in ways that we weren't expecting. And we've set out in the review what we think useful transparency could mean. It doesn't mean necessarily publishing every detail of the code. It might be useful sometimes, but often it isn't, actually. If you're building an algorithm based on a big set of data that you almost certainly can't publish because it's personal data about individuals, then actually the code of how you did the learning might tell you something. It probably doesn't tell you an awful lot about some of the underlying stats and the underlying details of the model. It's probably far more useful to be open about how it is that model or that algorithm is being used in the decision-making process. For the sorts of significant decisions we're talking about, it's very rare and probably non-existent that it's actually making a complete decision. No one's seriously suggesting that you make a decision about a custody process or something based on purely on an algorithm. It's a support tool that's supporting an individual human in doing that. So being clear and transparent about how you're intending to use that, what the safeguards are, how you built the model, what data you trained it on, how you thought about fairness, what fairness objectives you set yourself, how you measured whether your outcomes were fair, how you're going to carry on monitoring whether the outcomes are fair as you go on, the assessments you made about impact on wider society and the individuals who are affected by it, and getting into just a routine habit of being really transparent about all that stuff, we think would have a really positive impact both on innovation, on the ability of the department to make progress in being more efficient, actually being more effective and hopefully more fair in how they make some of these decisions, but also offer the ability for sort of wider society to look and challenge. And then on the private sector side, the incentives are a bit funny as well sometimes. It's, I think, generally accepted in the kind of equality community, certainly in the UK, that gathering data about equality impacts and discrimination is a good thing. We've made progress on things like gender pay gaps and diversity in recruitment by gathering data and holding organisations to account on whether they are achieving equality and diversity. And in that sense, we say gathering data is a good thing. But there are areas where organisations are reluctant to do it. There's a number of drivers for that. So if you ask a bank, maybe you should think about fairness by ethnicity in your loan decisions, and they go, yeah, we probably should really. That's the thing we want to do. We're a responsible organisation. We want to be fair, but we are nervous about data protection. So we are nervous about whether it is okay for us to be gathering data about someone's ethnicity. That's probably not a real, genuine legal problem, but I am sympathetic to the nervousness that you might have around it in an era of GDPR and large fines for misuse of data. You can see why people wish to be cautious. And I think, possibly there are some bigger drivers than that. Like, people are nervous about the reaction of their customers. Do you expect to be asked about your ethnicity when you apply for a loan? Probably not. It's certainly not common practice, although we did do some interesting public polling around this and found that actually people were generally okay with it in a number of cases if it was explained how that data was being used and why. And possibly a bigger driver, and this is where the incentives do get a bit funny, is if you gather a lot of data about how fair your organisation is being, it's then a huge, great big evidence base for how fair your organisation is being. And for all your good intentions about being fair, there is a bit of a risk that you open up a lot of analysis about historical issues around bias. And you can imagine an organisation's board sitting there with a lawyer in the room saying, actually, it's just too scary to know. We want to be ethical. We want to make our processes better. But it's a real corporate risk for us opening that up. And I do think there's a real question around how do we create the right incentives for organisations to do the right thing, gather data, monitor what they're doing, make their processes more ethical and more fair as time goes on. And there's not an easy answer to that, but there are, I think, a number of things that regulators and others could do just to kind of tip the scales a little bit towards that.
So I actually have a follow-up question that I'm afraid is not on the list of questions I sent you, but so I was at a conference earlier this week, actually last week, and there was a panel on the overhype of tech, and one of the problems people were talking about was this lack of education. So relating to your suggestion that we need more transparency, do you think there's a danger that even if you try to be transparent about what your algorithms might be doing, that because the general public and the media, for example, might not have the understanding of AI, that it might always get kind of twisted and blown out of proportion? So I don't know if you can speak to that and maybe how we can prevent overhype.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, actually, in a number of ways. I think it's definitely right as an issue. A couple of thoughts on it. Maybe I'm not going to directly answer the question, but a couple of thoughts on this. Well, one is, I think some of this is a lot less new than we tend to think it is. And maybe this comes to your overhype point a bit. So organisations have made decisions in structured ways for years and years and years. When you apply for a loan, or you to some extent certainly apply for a job in a big organisation, people don't just sit there and go, oh, I like that one, don't like that one, I'll give them one, I won't give them one. They have some structured process given to them by their organisation, a policy, or an algorithm, you could even call it, where they follow and say, if it meets these conditions, then you give them one, if it doesn't, then no. And maybe there's some human judgment on the edge for difficult or unusual cases. We've all thought for years about what are the right control mechanisms to make sure that's done fairly. So in recruitment, we train people in unconscious bias. We think about what are objective ways of assessing candidates rather than just pretending that we have great judgment and say I like that person, they look good. How do you actually assess objectively somebody's capabilities? And to an extent, a lot of the use of algorithms we're talking about is another tool in the kind of set of inputs into a decision. And I think said in that way and explained in that way, it's not as hard to understand as is sometimes perceived. I think there's a kind of sense of black magic about some of it that gets out there sometimes, and people feel it's too hard and don't feel able to think about it. And actually, I think there are a lot of aspects of it that everyone does understand if explained in the right way, and we just need to get the language right about how we're talking about it. And that, by the way, doesn't just apply to the general public. I think it applies really strongly to organisations who are using these tools. So I think there is an extent to which some of the decisions about fairness in this space are almost getting pushed down to data scientists and developers, who are often trying to do the right thing but don't necessarily have the wider organisation and societal perspective on all of it. These are big organisational decisions about what fairness means for a big decision-making process run by an organisation, and it's kind of not okay for the chief exec to say, oh well, that's a kind of statistical data sciencey thing, you data scientists deal with that over there and just tell me the answer. It's got to be a thing that a whole organisation is thinking about. What do we mean by fair? Is it about equal outcomes for equal groups? Is it about making sure that every individual has a chance for redress and a chance to challenge the decision that's made about them? Is it about making sure that we're not ignoring groups and we're taking account of unusual circumstances like disability, for example, in the way we're doing a recruitment process? And that is something that we do need kind of whole organisation just to engage in the thinking about. And then there's a sort of statistical bit on the side, which is really important, but it's not the whole thing. And that, I think, has got lost a little bit in some of the conversation. It feels like there's a kind of developer data scientist conversation. It's actually, it's great. There's lots going on, lots of really good academic research, lots of papers, lots of methodologies, but it's kind of got a bit detached from the wider conversations about equality and discrimination and fairness that happen in the sort of wider world of business and the public sector. And we need to bring them together again. So that was a very long answer to a question, follow-up question.
That was a very good answer, I think.
Yeah, no.
Definitely.
Yeah, I was going to say, actually, I think that's a good answer, because I think up to this point, like you were saying, there's been a bit of a disparity between, I think, especially in big organisations, different departments kind of keeping things separate, and then maybe putting like a lot of the onus, like you were saying, on the technical people, when actually it should be a whole organisational consensus for these topics, especially with fairness and bias and transparency. It needs to be a whole organisational consensus so that we can get it in the right direction.
Yeah, I suppose actually, particularly in some of the academic literature around, I think the word fairness has taken on quite a specific meaning often. So if you read a paper on algorithmic fairness, it is often talking about a specific statistical way of measuring bias, either at a group level or an individual level. And that is quite a narrow concept of fairness. It's a really useful one to look at. But I don't think if you ask most people on the street what they mean by fair, they would very specifically mean kind of measurement of a percentage difference between two different groups, for example. They would mean much wider things like sort of fair process, the ability to challenge a decision, the ability to ask for an explanation of a decision. All of those things, form a part of this wider notion of fairness. And I think it's quite important that we don't sort of pigeonhole it into being this really specific thing, and do think about it end to end.
Yeah, I think definitely that's something that tech can suffer from in academic research, of trying to put a numeric value on something that is just very abstract. And
so how do you foresee the UK being a world leader in ethical AI?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I think there's a lot of opportunities here for the UK. Obviously, AI is something which it means a lot of different things to different people, and lots of different countries are pursuing it in different ways. It is an area the UK is strong in. We have a lot of good universities doing interesting research, a lot of innovative companies building new products. And I think we also have done better than most, and both in the government space and outside, at thinking through some of the ethical issues. We found as we were doing this review, actually, that we kept finding ourselves drifting to examples from other countries because there was sort of more evidence of harm and more problems. And that isn't said at all that there aren't any risks, any problems in the UK. But I think not as many of the problems have yet come to pass in the UK. And on the government side, I think the UK government has actually been really forward-leaning in getting a data ethics framework out there, forcing public sector organisations to think through some of the ethical issues. Some of the provisions in the Equality Act, although we think more clarity is needed around them, there are some really strong bits that do force particularly public sector organisations to think through equality impacts of what they're building. So there's some really good examples of, I think, how the UK government is getting ahead, and where I think some of the longer term opportunities are for the UK. There's a lot of talk obviously at the moment about Brexit and what will the UK economy do after Brexit. One area, of course, which we are strong as a country is in professional services and in services that help organisations think through things. So there's lots of accountancy services and consultancy services and things that the UK does a lot on. And actually, I think we do see there is an emerging market here in almost AI ethics services. A few organisations are already starting to offer kind of ethics consultancy and assurance type services. And there's a bit of a risk here that we drift into some kind of ethics becomes hiring a consultant to do ethics for you, which I don't think any of us would want to see. But we think there definitely is a role in some sort of specialist professional roles in thinking through ethical implications of algorithms. And I think that is an area that you could easily see the UK building an industry and building a kind of world-leading group of people who are capable of doing that. And I think that's something that the government definitely has in back of mind as it's thinking about strategies for AI in the UK. We aren't going to outcompete China for scale of what's going on in building of AI, but we can outcompete on the way in which we're thinking about ethics and the way in which we're thinking about building things that are responsible and therefore to an extent also long-term successful and sustainable. I think we've seen backlash against a number of algorithmic products and things that people have had to withdraw and stop doing because they perhaps hadn't thought it through properly. So I think there is, not just ethical value in doing it right, but there is business value in thinking things through properly, thinking about impacts and building a thing that isn't going to suffer in the same way from some of that backlash.
Thank you for that, Mark. I found that really interesting that you kind of foresee potentially the UK maybe being a big world player in ethical consulting and all the different things that the UK could potentially offer to this ethical AI space. So really appreciate your insights there. So we wanted to give you this opportunity to talk about anything that particularly you felt strongly about in the report or anything that you felt that you haven't covered so far.
So I think the bit I found most interesting as I've gone through this review, it's worth saying I come from more of a tech delivery type background, so I think kind of big policy reviews are actually quite a new thing for me personally. Other members of the team come from more of a kind of policy and social science type background. I come from the technical side. And I think the thing I found most interesting as we went through was the number of diverse views about what was meant by bias and discrimination and fairness and equality. And it had never really struck me just how confused a space it was. Lots of people have really crystal clear views by what they mean by it. And perhaps almost there's a certain lack of awareness that there are lots of other very different views out there as well. We labelled our review bias because it was the title we were given originally and it was the area we were asked to focus on, but we definitely realised the further we went that it was just one issue among a number of fairness issues, and there is I think a need to find some much more common language collectively about how we're talking about these issues and how we link them back to lots of the debates about fairness that have been going on for decades, centuries even, about what is fair and what isn't. On future work, I think CDEI is having a bit of a think at the moment about how we as an organisation can most effectively influence some of this stuff going forward. So we've written a review. We've identified quite a lot of next steps and things that government should be doing, regulators should be doing, organisations should be doing, and we definitely have a role in supporting some of that activity. We are increasingly also looking to work in partnership with public sector organisations who are building algorithms and thinking about their use of data, to kind of help really operationalise some of this best practice, not just kind of write bits of guidance, write frameworks, but think about what they look like in practice, provide some of the kind of skills and cross-cutting expertise for organisations to assess risk of bias, to consult effectively and meaningfully with the public about impacts of things. And that's not easy. It's not just a case of asking, like, do you like this algorithm or not? I think getting a useful response is much more subtle than that. Thinking about kind of futures analysis and some of the longer term implications of algorithms that you might deploy now. And I think all of these areas, CDEI is building up our capability, looking at how we can most effectively support definitely public sector organisations and possibly slightly more indirectly private sector organisations.
Yeah, so Mark, it was really great to have you. Thank you very much for joining us and for telling us about the report.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming on, and it's been great to learn more about the work of the Centre for Data Ethics and Innovation and more about the report, and I'm sure our audience will be really intrigued to hear more. Thank you so much for tuning in, guys, today. We hope that you enjoyed today's content. We'll be leaving details about how you can get in touch with CDEI if you do have any questions for them specifically.
And if you have any questions, comments, or topic suggestions for us, if you liked our discussion today, or maybe if you didn't, you can reach out to us on Twitter at Let's Chat Ethics, or you can pop us an email at letschatethics@gmail.com. So thank you very much for joining us, and we'll see you next week.
See you next week. Bye.